Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about Middle Eastern Jews in Israel, the Mizrahi. Many Jews throughout the Middle East came to Israel in the middle of the 20th century. In Israel, they were literally considered at the time to be black. And similar to African Americans in the United States, the Mizrahi were discriminated against and were forced to live in segregated, poor communities. In response, the Mizrahi even formed their own Black Panther Party. We will be talking about that today. But with time as a political voting bloc, the Mizrahi largely aligned themselves eventually with Israel's hard-right Likud party. We're going to talk about all of this today with Asaf Elia-Shalev. Asaf Elia-Shalev is an Israeli-American journalist based in Los Angeles. He is a staff writer for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and he is the author of the book that he joins us to talk about called Israel's Black Panthers, the Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth. Asaf Elia-Shalev, it's my good pleasure. Shalev, forgive me. It's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Hi, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell me more about who the Mizrahi are. I think there are many different kinds of and groups of Jews. You have Ashkenazi, Sephardic, you have Ethiopian Jews. Just so we're clear, can you tell? Are Mizrahi Middle Eastern Jews in general, or Jews who came to Israel from the Middle East?
Well, I think that people have different opinions on how they use the term, and or in other words, people use it in different ways. But yes, I think it's important to remember when we look at Israel's the makeup of the Jewish population in Israel that more than half are estimated to be Mizrahi, meaning that they have roots in the countries of the Middle East. And so when we say Mizrahi, we refer to Jews who either immigrated from or have parents or grandparents from countries as diverse as Morocco, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and also Iran, which is part of the Middle East, but not Arab. And that kind of is another nuance there. And even Indian Jews have been kind of lumped together. And the reason you can have Jews from such different countries in one group is because they were the darker skinned ones. And when they arrived in Israel, they may have spoke different languages and didn't really see themselves as part of the same group, but they had a similar experience in Israel of being racialized. And so that racialization and that common experience created this category that now we call Mizrahi Jews. So we had kind of different divisions beforehand among Jews, there the Ashkenazi Jews and maybe Sephardic Jews. And Sephardic has some overlap with Mizrahi, but Sephardic has more to do with how Judaism is practiced. And there's some, so that's a distinction, but Yemenite Jews, for example, are not Sephardic. They have their own customs. So it gets kind of complicated, but today you have a lot of Jews who have Middle Eastern roots living in the United States, and they might identify as Mizrahi, because that's kind of the term they've borrowed from Israel. But the term really came to be out of this ethnic relations within Israeli society.
And Ashkenazi, that's European Jews?
Yeah, that's going to be Jews that come from Central and Eastern Europe, so Poland, Germany, former Soviet Union. Yeah.
And Sephardi, for some reason I always thought of Spain. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, that's correct. So in 500 years ago, so we really have to go that far back, there were many Jews living in Spain, and then there was an expulsion. The kingdom expelled the Jews and the Muslims, or forced them to convert to Catholicism, but those who didn't were expelled, and they went all over the Mediterranean basin. A lot went to the Ottoman Empire, a lot went to Morocco and to Egypt, and in all these countries or regions there were already Jews, right? So that predated them, and then they kind of mixed, and so Sephardic does have that connection as well.
That's interesting. Yeah. And in the 1950s in Israel, as you were mentioning, they had a common experience regardless of exactly where throughout the Middle East they came from. And I said this in my introduction, they were literally considered to be black. This is before
let's talk about that.
Yeah, this is before Ethiopian
Right.
Jews come?
This is before the Ethiopian Jews arrived, and also before the migrant workers and refugees arrived in Israel from sub-Saharan Africa. So the recent 15 years, we've seen a large number of black Africans arrive in Israel. But if you have to go back in time, and you have to 1950s, 60s, even in the 70s. First of all, Mizrahim talked about themselves as being black, and also Ashkenazi Jews saw them as black, and there was a common racial epithet that was borrowed from Yiddish. They'd call them sometimes Schwarze Chaya, which in Yiddish means black animal. Which is interesting because when they become the Black Panthers, they're kind of reclaiming that term. They're like, "Oh, we're black animals? No, we're going to be Black Panthers, and you're not going to like it one bit." So,
yeah, so they're reclaiming the term. I mean, huh?
Yeah.
And to be clear, that they named themselves the Black Panthers. It's just the name of your book. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they were inspired. I mean, they looked around the world at different revolutionary movements, and they both liked the message and aesthetic of the American Black Panthers, but they also knew that group and that name would piss off the establishment more than these other things that were available. If you had the Tupamaros in Uruguay, you had the Red Army, and you had all these groups all over Europe, and even they looked at East Asia for a while. So yeah.
And they were inspired by the Black Panthers.
Yes, directly inspired by them. Yeah.
Talk to me more about the 1950s. This is when many Middle Eastern Jews come to Israel. What's behind that dynamic?
So in 1948, well, we should go back in time a little further, right? So what's important to understand is the Zionist movement came together in the late 1800s to solve the terrible problem of European anti-Semitism, pogroms and the like. And there was this idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine and modeling it after Europe. There was an explicit idea that this would be a European-style state in the Middle East. They used the word colonize at the time. And the problem was, in the early 20th century, millions of Jews left Europe, but they didn't go to Israel. They didn't heed, or to what at the time was Palestine. They didn't heed the Zionist call. Instead, they went to North America, which is why we have such a big and robust Jewish community in the United States. And then in the Holocaust, the Nazis exterminated 6 million Jews, European Jews, right? And then after the Holocaust, there were still some Jews left in Europe, but they were locked up behind the Iron Curtain. So the Soviet Union wouldn't allow them to leave. And so 1948, when Israel is established, declares its independence, there aren't that many Jews there, and they know they need more people in order to really build a state. And that's when we start to see the Arab states start to push out their Jews, and Israel starts to want them to welcome them in, and that's both a solution to the demographic problem that Israel was having upon its founding, but it was at the same time it created a new problem, right? So, in 1948, about 1 million Palestinians flee or are kicked out of Palestine, and in their stead come nearly 1 million Mizrahi Jews, and they look uncomfortably similar to the people that were just removed. They speak Arabic. Their customs are Arab. They're darker skinned, and that generates a lot of anxiety for the leadership of this nascent country. They say in public and private settings, they talk about how worried they are about the country being Arabized or being Orientalized because of the influx of Mizrahi immigrants. And so, they describe these immigrants in very racist terms. They, everything from dirty Africans, referring to the Jews of Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding father, the first prime minister, he talks, we have quotes from him where he talks about Mizrahi Jews as being unmannered, unclean, prone to rape and murder and thievery, right? And so when you have a whole population that's described in this way, that are described as a threat, well, you have to do something about that threat. Like they're going to overrun your country, right? So you're justifying now mistreating them. And so what you have in the 1950s is the creation of a kind of second-class citizenship for Mizrahi Jews. In every realm where government policy interacted with Mizrahi Jews, they're kind of relegated to the margins. So education, they were tracked to vocational schools instead of like Ashkenazim, who were tracked into academic programs. And that was based on this idea that the Jews of the Middle East had been, their intellectual capacity had been diminished by exposure to Arabs. That was the actual defining philosophy of the pedagogy in Israel at the time. So they they weren't fit for academic learning and abstract thought. That was the kind of the idea. In employment, they were relegated to like low-level jobs. They were brought in essentially to pave roads, cut down trees, work in factories. And the Ashkenazi Jews, like kind of upon the arrival of the Mizrahim, they all jumped up in status and they became the managerial class, which was interesting because they originally saw themselves as the socialist, as the Hebrew worker. They wanted to create a society inspired by socialism, and wanted Jews to be the ones who are the workers. But once they had a cheap labor coming into the country, they appointed themselves managers. In the area of housing, that's a really important one. Mizrahim were generally relegated to the margins of the country, so the borders, where there were tent encampments sometimes, or abandoned Palestinian homes, and barred from, in many cases, barred from coming to the center where there was economic opportunity. And being in the margins also meant that they were subject to violence from neighboring Arab countries, because there was a state of war. So the first people, Israeli Jews, to like suffer when there was fighting were Mizrahi Jews. And so you have a massive drop from the moment they arrive, there's a massive drop in socioeconomic status for Mizrahi Jews. They'd come from big cities like Constantinople and Casablanca and Baghdad to a country that was very provincial and far less cosmopolitan and far poorer. And they were not allowed to participate as equals in the building of the country.
Your grandfather, or perhaps even grandparents, came from Iraq?
Yeah, on my father's side, both my grandparents came from Baghdad. And my mom's side, they were Sephardic Jews from Bulgaria. So that's the kind of the category that they came from Europe, but they're not Ashkenazi. They were lighter skinned, but they're not quite Mizrahi either. So yeah, we don't have to get into the subcategories too much, but yes.
But is because your mom was Sephardic and your dad was Mizrahi, did that lead them to know each other, to be able to meet, to be able to get married?
No, I don't think so. No, okay. I wouldn't say so.
Yeah. I want to go back to 1948 and the years that followed. Israel was created in 1948 to the opposition of its neighbors. And then does its neighbors, the Arab states, then retaliate against the Jews in their own states and then kick them out? And then now people are being forced to leave? Are they being lured over by Israel? Is it a little bit of both?
A very complicated story, and it starts before 48 even, in the 40s already, and probably you could find examples in the 30s. But Jews had a complicated history in the Middle East. All historians agree that they were far better off than the Jews of Europe. There were periods of violence towards Jews I'm talking over the course of like 1,000 years, right? And there are periods of prosperity, coexistence, peace. In Europe, Jews were kind of like the property of the king, like they had no status. And in the Middle East, at worst, they were dhimmis, which is kind of a second-class status, but it was still a legally recognized status within Islamic society. And then, when European colonialism kind of takes over the Middle East, that is actually a period where Jews in many of the countries prosper, and they get to participate in the system, and they get to be included in society. And for this in the early 20th century, there's this period where it's actually people are Jews and Arabs at the same time. They go back and forth through both. They're in both communities at once. It's not seen as a strict dichotomy between Jew and Arab. Identities are fluid. But with the rise of Zionism leading up to 1948 and the rise at the same time of Arab nationalism, there is this creation of a binary. So the Arab nationalism, in some places and sometimes Jews were totally part of those movements, but slowly as this friction with the Zionist movement increases, Jews are not allowed to participate in those movements. They're seen as suspicious. They're seen as collaborators with French or British colonial regimes, and as I mentioned, Zionism says, well, we need these people, and in some cases they are facing real dangers, and we want to help them as Jews, and so does that answer the question? I'm wondering if I could talk about this forever, but does that answer it?
Yeah. So they're given citizenship as they arrive, but it's a second class, maybe third class.
Well, officially, it's like the same citizenship. Just in terms, right? So they're Israeli citizens, but in terms of the policies that are enacted upon them, that's what creates the second class citizenship, right? That's where they're seen as unfit for higher learning, unfit for better paying jobs. They're fit for being grunt workers. Okay, well, once you have that idea about a person, then you don't have to give them too much, and you're justified in sicking the police on them when they misbehave and things like that.
Yeah. One last question before I dive into Israel's Black Panthers themselves. You mentioned earlier that the Mizrahi in the 1950s were oftentimes forced to live at the outskirts in, it seems like, tent cities or encampments. And then eventually, and I also saw this in your book, if they were given homes, it was oftentimes homes that were formerly of Palestinians. Was that a common experience?
Yeah, totally common. I mean, it really depends on where. So there are all these development towns built in the outskirts of the country. And in one case, people, I heard about a story where people didn't want to get off the trucks to go stay in these. They refused to get off the trucks and demanded to be sent back to Haifa or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And so they started using trucks that have like those lifts that dump out the contents, and they dump the people out, and like, you can't come back. In other cases, in places like Haifa and Jerusalem and near Tel Aviv, and in Tel Aviv itself, actually, there were entire neighborhoods that were depopulated of Palestinians. And so Mizrahim either were assigned those houses or just moved into them without permission. And that's kind of actually the story of the Panthers, of how they came to be where they were in Jerusalem. So it's a good transition point. So do you want me to explain what happens next?
Let me just tell everyone who you are again. We are, okay. This is Letter, and who we are. And we are Letters and Politics. And we are in conversation with Asaf Elia-Shalev, who is a journalist and author of the book Israel's Black Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth. Yeah, pick up where you were.
Yeah, great. So there's this particular set of families from Morocco who come to Israel in 1950, so way before the bulk of Moroccan Jewry arrives. Right? They actually have a better situation than most Mizrahi Jews, and they stay in Morocco, many of them through the 60s. But these families, they heed the Zionist call in 1950. They have a history of being very observant Jews and praying to Jerusalem and wanting, and this idea of returning to the Holy Land is just enchanting to them. And they come and they have a very difficult journey. They face discrimination on the way to Israel. We don't have to get into that too much because I want to fast forward to, right? So there was this attempt to put these families in the desert or keep them in these transit camps forever, but they say no. We we came to the Holy Land to go to Jerusalem. Like that's what we came here for. So don't try to put us in the desert or in some random place. And they insist, and they just make their own way, sometimes against the wishes of the government, to Jerusalem. But where there's nowhere for them to be exactly. So they find an area called the No Man's Land. So Jerusalem in 1948 becomes a divided city, much like Berlin was a divided city. Jordan controls the eastern part where Palestinians live, and Israel controls the western part. In the middle is a no man's land because the two countries are at war. There's barbed wire there. There's no government services. And there's snipers kind of located opposite each other, shooting back and forth. And in the middle, there's these Palestinian neighborhoods that their owners left, at the outset of the war. And that is where these families, Mizrahi families, move into these homes that are in the war zone that don't technically belong to Israel even, right? They're beyond the armistice line in the strip where it's between the two countries. And they make homes for themselves there. This, on the one hand, Israel doesn't provide them services. There's no you have sewage running through their street. You have no government services, no school, until later on you get a religious school. But also, Israel does want them to be there because that is kind of Jews occupying extra land. So they're actually taking over land on behalf of the state. And they grow up in this like ethnic ghetto, right? Because they have very little interaction with other Israelis. They are mostly Moroccan Jews, so the children are all growing up speaking Moroccan Arabic, and so the Hebrew is terrible. They have strong accents, and crushing poverty, living tent to a room. I said sewage running through the streets, like just the only time they see one of the only times they see Israelis is when police officers kind of come to the neighborhood to beat up a kid who was suspected of stealing some fruit at the market. Or that's the kind of situation you have. That before, where these kids who are going to become Panthers, that's where they grow up.
Who is Ruben Abel?
Yeah, so he is one of the founders of the Panthers. He belonged to one of these families who make their way to the no man's land in Jerusalem from Morocco. He's actually one of the last founders. Really, you could say the last founder who's still alive. There are a few others who also played very important roles who are alive, but he's kind of the last major leader. And he's 80 years old now. And do you want me to tell you about contemporary stuff about him, or go back to?
Well, you met up with him. I mean, this is sort of your entryway even into
right, that's exactly.
the Israel's Black Panthers, right? You've interviewed him many times.
Yes, yeah. So I made my way to Israel after college, worked at the local newspaper, and then went to a party, and he was there, and we got to talking. I had actually met him. I'd actually heard a lecture from him before, and that left a big impression. But we started talking, and we had this idea that I'm an American. I speak Hebrew fluently. That I would interview him, and we'll figure out what to do with the interviews later. We had no idea. I had no idea that I'd have a book one day. I was 23, 24, not an experienced writer at all. And he loved the idea because he felt that his lack of knowing English had kept the story of Mizrahi Jews and the Black Panthers of Israel from ever exiting the borders of the country. He felt like it was a cage. So at one point, he told me that our conversations felt like smuggling a letter out of jail. And we sat, and I think we recorded 50 hours of interviews in those years. And I also was helping him give these tours. So he organized these tours in the neighborhood where the Black Panthers came up, and I would interpret to the English-speaking audience as live interpretation. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was training my brain to speak his words into English, and that became very useful later on when he becomes a character in my book, where I have to really figure out how he sounds in English, because he speaks in these philosophical ways, and and in very interesting allusions and these meandering ways. And got very lucky that I was able to put that into English on a week by week basis with these tours. And he really spent the past 25 years, 30 years being like a major human rights activist and social justice activist, and has been involved in every kind of progressive struggle in Israel, alongside Ethiopian Jews, alongside Palestinians, LGBTQ, public housing advocates, anything you can think of, he's been there. And indefatigable. I'm not going to even try to say that word.
Indefatigable?
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe I shouldn't try to say it either.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
The Black Panthers in Israel were well known in Israel and are still well remembered?
I mean, at the time, they dominated the headlines. They were in the streets, massive demonstrations. They totally dominated the kind of the conversation for more than a year. And yes, they're widely remembered today, especially by people who lived through that period. And I think young people aren't taught about them in school, so they know of the Panthers because they're like an important cultural reference. But I don't think young people today have a very good understanding of what the movement was about.
Are they remembered by the hard right today?
Oh yeah, that's one of the fun things is the Israeli right is nostalgic about the Black Panthers. Like imagine the Republican Party being nostalgic about the Black Panther Party of Oakland. Like that wouldn't make any sense, would it?
Give it a few years, it might.
Yeah. No, the hard right. Yeah. So they part of how the hard right gets elected is they claim to represent the grievances of Mizrahi Jews in Israel, and they play to identity politics. And because the Black Panthers were this authentic grassroots mass movement, the hard right likes to claim that as part of their own legacy, and kind of whitewash the fact that the Panthers were leftists and advocated for things that Likud would never go for. But because there's that authenticity is there, they try to co-opt it, and they sometimes manage to.
I want to dive more into that in just a moment, but I don't want to get too ahead of where we are. You begin your book. Let's talk about the late 1960s. Let's talk about now we have Israel's Black Panther Party. You begin your book with what's known as Operation Milk. And in this, you sort of basically call them Israel's Robin Hood. Mm-hmm. What was Operation Milk?
Yeah, so 1972, spring morning, early in the morning, the Panthers go out and they steal the milk that's delivered to the doorsteps of the rich folk in Jerusalem. Right, that's how you got milk in those days. And they steal the milk from this entire neighborhood, and they leave little notes behind saying, thank you so much for your contribution to the war on poverty. We're so sorry your cats and dogs won't have milk to drink this morning. We hope you understand. And that
was their note to the rich folks.
Yeah,
they're stealing the milk from.
Yeah, and then they take the milk and they deliver it to one of the poor neighborhoods in Jerusalem, to the doorsteps, and they leave a note there, and they say, right, this is all pre-dawn, and they leave a note for people saying, here's milk for you today. This is thanks to the Black Panthers. Don't expect this tomorrow. The only way you're going to be able to have milk, this luxury, is if you join our struggle and you fight for your rights.
And it was effective.
I mean, it was a publicity stunt, and it was very effective at getting attention. The press wouldn't stop talking about it for weeks, and it's one of the most memorable stories about the Panthers to this day. And if was it effective at growing the movement? Probably to some extent, but they were already in a different phase by that point. That was not an early action. That was like a year into the movement. Yeah.
Unlike there were significant differences between the Black Panthers of the United States, born in Oakland, California, and the Black Panthers in Israel's Black Panthers. In Israel, they didn't carry guns, and they weren't necessarily hardcore revolutionaries. Is that correct? That what they were really looking for was it was more like it seemed like more like a civil rights movement. They wanted equality.
Yes, they're very different, right? The American Panthers were, like hardcore Marxists, revolutionaries, part of this global movement seeking to overthrow capitalism, overthrow imperialism. They were very serious about that, right? They read their Marx, they read their Fanon, and they had guns. And I mean, the Panthers had a whole arsenal in the United States. And where the American Panthers lasted longer and were better organized. The Israeli Panthers talked a big game about being radical. They used phrases like "by any means necessary." They threatened it to overthrow the state, but they weren't as ideological as the American Panthers. They weren't. They didn't take things nearly that far. No weapons, of course. And ultimately, what I believe is that they wanted to belong. If the American Panthers said, "Well, okay, white America is racist. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to get rid of," the Israeli Panthers, they didn't want to create a separatist movement. They didn't want. They wanted to belong. They wanted that this like deep yearning to belong. They were very angry at being excluded from society, from the military, from jobs, from having any opportunity to contribute meaningfully. And so they talked about being radical, but ultimately they really wanted to participate. And that's true about Mizrahim in general. Like they were invited to Israel to be equal partners in the creation of a Jewish state. And it was very humiliating and angering for them to be treated the way they were upon arrival. But they never gave up on their insistence to be equals. And
was there any connection or even communication between the Black Panther Party of the United States, and you have many different chapters, but any of them and Israel's Black Panthers?
So they do, not at first. About 2 years into the Israeli movement, they go to Europe to one of these like communist or socialist conferences of international radicals that were happening in those days. And they have and they meet some Panthers there. There's no documentation of what that conversation was like, but also they had no language in common. And then later on, they have some, again, like at these international things, there's some interactions, but not many. Yeah. And I'm not entirely, it's not entirely clear how much the American Panthers are aware of or care about having this group in Israel. There were, because there were Panther-inspired groups all over the world. There were the Dalit Panthers in India, the Aboriginal Panthers in Australia. The UK had a movement, right? And there was obviously Panther activity in Algeria and Cuba. And so Israel was like just backwaters at the time. And also the American Panthers were allies to the Palestinian cause. And so probably it took a while to sort out what that meant in terms of their interactions with underclass Jews in Israel.
Yeah, the American Black Panthers were supportive of Palestinians. How did the Panthers and I guess should we be careful when we talk about Israel's Panthers and the Mizrahim of Israel? I mean, is this what I mean is Israel's Black Panthers just sort of one segment of the Mizrahi in Israel, or what do you think it represented the group as a whole? Were they largely popular within?
Yeah, they were very popular. Mm-hmm. They were very, very popular. I mean, some people might have thought that they were too militant or something. But there was no one could deny, like, there was massive discrimination and inequality that wasn't being talked about, and they caused that conversation to burst wide open. Yeah. And so whatever disagreements people had with the Panthers, whatever factionalization that happened, everyone could agree that there was a problem on their hands and something needed to be done about it. So that was the importance of their role.
So through the 1950s and then through the 1960s, I think the Israel's Black Panthers were formed around 1967 or so.
Yeah. Well, 1971 is officially, but 1967 is where Jerusalem gets unified into one city. When Israel conquers it, the rest of the territory, and then that is what changes everything, that allows kind of these foreign influences to get into Israel, and that's why you have these young men who decide to take on that mantle.
So how does Israel's Black Panthers and maybe the Mizrahi community in general feel about Palestinians during this 50s and 60s when they're clearly being discriminated against?
Well, there's a lot of different reactions. I think a lot of Mizrahim are in living in poverty and struggling to survive, and maybe not having too many, not giving that much thought, or just whatever the mainstream thinks. But there are a lot of Mizrahim who kind of express solidarity with Palestinians at the time, and there's some initiatives like these common committees that are created, and so it is possible to find those kind of examples. And then there are, of course, a lot of Mizrahim who even then, and I think it gets worse over time, kind of have feel a lot of animosity towards Palestinians and towards Arabs in general, and there's complicated reasons for that. The Panthers, on the other hand, very early on decide to they're not going to be like the rest of Israel. If they are going to be very, very left-wing on the Palestinian issue, they already in 1975 call to recognize a Palestinian state. At the time in Israel, like no one was like, the Palestinian cause was considered illegitimate, like just terrorism. No one was talking about a two-state solution. The Panthers were the first ones to meet Yasser Arafat, who again was considered just an outlaw and a terrorist. And only 12 years later, in the Oslo Accord period, does the Israeli government recognize Yasser Arafat as the legitimate leader of the Palestinian movement, right? So they were way ahead of their time. They saw Mizrahim as a bridge to the Arab world, as they believed that peace and diplomacy should not just run through Ashkenazim as it always has, but should run through Mizrahim, because they're the ones who can make peace with the Arabs. Yeah.
And how about the Mizrahi and Palestinians in Israel?
So they're in places like Akko and Haifa and other areas. There is, or in Jerusalem, right? Let's talk about Jerusalem for a second. After 67, when the wall comes down, which is like kind of akin to the Berlin Wall falling down, like a huge historic change, you have this period of flourishing relationships between Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They create businesses together. They have nightlife together. They are criminals together, right? They have, so every aspect of life. There's relationships. You have from like 1967 to like the late 70s, this period that's really has not been researched very much at all. I struggled very hard to find anyone who's written about this period, but there was what today we call coexistence, and there was this mutual recognition. They saw themselves on the other side of the wall, the fences that were separating them, and they had 18 years of wondering who's on the other side, and then suddenly the fence comes down, and they fall in love. Like they smoke hash together. They go to each other's homes, and that's a history that's unfortunately been forgotten. In other cases, however, as I mentioned, I think in the start of our conversation, Mizrahim really bore the brunt of violence from whether it was in the 50s Palestinian militants who kind of went on raids into Israel, or the foreign armies that were when there was a war. And then later on, when there were bus bombings, it's like, who takes the bus in Israel? Mizrahim. I mean, sure, there's Ashkenazim on the bus, of course, but like who's overrepresented? Like poor people, Mizrahi people. And so they were the ones when the buses were blowing up, they're the ones who were dying. And so there was this anger, and there's also a certain memory about their interactions, even if it's not direct memory, even if it's like inherited from your parents or your grandparents. There's a kind of a cultural, generational memory about the past. So many Mizrahim who actually lived among Arabs and among Muslims, like, remember this, very fondly remember those times. But there's also this narrative that they're the enemy, and many Mizrahim emphasize that because some of them were mistreated, and they did remember instances, and because being against the Arabs and being a strong nationalist was like a ticket into the mainstream, like was the way to participate in Israeli society more fully by being more militant than Ashkenazim. Like an Ashkenazi Jew who has had all the privilege and all the status, like, he didn't have to be anti-Arab. He's got everything. He's got the resources, runs the country. Why does he or she need to be anti-Arab? Like, whereas a Mizrahi person can, like, say, hey, no, I'm going to be more hawkish. I'm going to be more militant, and that way, I'm going to be listened to more, and I'm going to be more aggressive, and so it's kind of an unfortunate incentive structure there.
Tell me about the rise of the hard right party Likud and how that fits into this dynamic that you're talking about.
Just to be clear about definitions, I have no problem with you calling the Likud hard right, but it's not how they're regarded in Israel. They're seen as like kind of more center right.
Okay.
But that just goes to show you like how far right Israeli politics go, because they're outflanked by a number of parties on the right. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Mizrahim wanted to belong, right? There was a recognition that Panthers were onto something very real, and Mizrahim kind of were freed from their loyalty to the old Labor Party due to the Panther struggle, and wanted to rebel against the establishment, but they also wanted to belong. And the person who kind of capitalized on that energy was Menachem Begin, the founder of Likud, the predecessor of Benjamin Netanyahu. And he told Panthers, wait a second, forget all this nonsense about you're lesser, you're dark skinned. No. You don't belong in the margins. You belong in the very center. You're the real heroes of this country. He had this incredible speech, just rhetorically and charismatically, about how telling Mizrahim, like, you're warriors, you're brothers, you're the real Jews. And I fought in the trenches in Israel's independence war. I fought alongside Iraqi Jews. Like, you are going to, when I come to power, you are going to be center stage right there with me. And that message was very appealing to many Mizrahim. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then an alliance was forged between Likud and many people in the Mizrahi public. Of course, Likud also has a lot of Ashkenazi support, so it's important not to forget that. Yeah.
But the Mizrahi, as a voting bloc, have continually been an important part of Likud's success over there. I mean, because it's sort of been in power ever since.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also a disdain that, and I'm speaking generally and broadly here, of course, but there's also this disdain towards the Labor Party, the more secular Labor Party in Israel as well, by the Mizrahi, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, that goes right back to how the condescension they faced from labor, from the Labor Party, and just taken for granted and mistreated, and that disdain is carried on to the present, in part because labor. Well, today's labor is kind of over. It's got only a few seats in parliament, so it's really that tradition is really ended. So there's other parties who represent the same interests, but there's a disdain towards the Israeli left among many Mizrahim, although there are many Mizrahim on the left, so none of this is absolute, or and that's because kind of the left in Israel tends to come from the Tel Aviv area, were from wealthier little towns or from the kibbutzim, and time again, big cultural icons of the Ashkenazi left like say racist things about Mizrahim and kind of reveal that there is still condescension and racism there, and Mizrahim recognize that. But they also like disagree with the politics of the left. It's like, I don't want to take agency away or act like they're not just emotional. Like there is an embrace of right-wing policies and a mockery, and they mock like the kind of ideals of the Israeli left as being inadequate for the region, as being hypocritical and unrealistic. Yeah.
Is religion important to this?
Yeah, religion is very important. The Panthers were secular, even though they grew up in very observant homes. But they didn't sweep Mizrahim into like anything, into a secular place. That there were right, part of what Likud did was emphasize Jewish identity and Jewish pride, and they would wear, Menachem Begin would wear a kippah on his head. And many, he was secular, but he wore a kippah on his head in many situations where maybe a labor leader wouldn't think to, because he was trying to show that he's Jewish. He's not just Israeli. Mizrahim who have were generally more, on average, more observant, like responded to that well. So right, it's about religion, but it's also about identity.
Is there still a level of tension between Mizrahi and Askanazi in Israel today?
A lot of people will deny it, but then in the same conversation, I've had this happen many times, where people are, no, this is all over, and then like 2 sentences later, they say something racist about Mizrahim. So. Or they acknowledge the reality of the tension by talking about like, oh my God, I can't believe they got married, or how could it be, or these comments that reveal that the people are paying attention. There's still inequality, right? Mizrahim have made massive strides in Israel. There's a massive Mizrahi middle class. There's many Mizrahi rich people. In media, there's and in the arts and culture, there's Mizrahi overrepresentation, if anything. Not in a bad way, but there's never been a Mizrahi prime minister. All the most important government ministers are all Ashkenazi to this day, right? Foreign ministry, defense, finance, treasury. These are all. The judiciary is very Ashkenazi. 90% of faculty in academic institutions are Ashkenazi. So there's still a lot of areas where there's inequality, but Mizrahim kind of, in many ways, dominate the public sphere. And then you have important kind of Ashkenazi cultural or political figures who will say something racist, and then like that explodes into a debate for 2 days and then takes over the news cycle. So clearly, it still matters to people.
I would think with the support that Likud gets from Mizrahi, that it would be important for Likud to have people from the Mizrahi community move up into its leadership or into powerful positions.
And there are many Mizrahi leaders in Likud. Many of the people occupying Likud parliament seats are Mizrahi, but and there are Mizrahi ministers from Likud, but the top ministers are not. You can make of that what you will.
Yeah. Asaf Elia-Shalev has been our guest. Asaf Elia-Shalev, again, is an Israeli-American journalist who's based in Los Angeles. He is a staff writer for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He has joined us for a conversation about his book. It's called Israel's Black Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth. Asaf Elia-Shalev, that was very informational. Thank you for taking this time.
Mitch, thank you so much.